Hello everyone! Today, since it is Disney vs. Original Work Fridays, we are going to be discussing another princess movie, as you can see by my crown. In case you guys aren't familiar with when and how I structure my Disney reviews, whenever I am wearing a crown, that means we're doing a princess movie or slash princess based story. Or if I'm wearing my mini ears, it means that we are doing something that is not necessarily related to a princess or a princess movie. So, with that being said, and getting that out of the way, let's discuss Beauty and the Beast. Beauty and the Beast, yes, probably one of the most well-known and probably the best, I guess, love story, you could say, that Disney's probably ever made. But again, this is just my opinion, but I think that's really what a lot of people get away from Beauty and the Beast. But regardless of whether you like or dislike Beauty and the Beast as a whole, as a film, it's fairly interesting to look at the original work as well, because the original work has a lot of interesting things within it. For the most part, the two are fairly different in how they are formatted. Even though the messages seem relatively the same, don't judge a book by its cover and such, that's pretty much a summary of what both these works are trying to say, both movie and original work. But the original work was written by Jeanne-Marie LePrince de Beaumont. I probably am totally pronouncing that name wrong. I am not good with French, but that is the French author of this book, or this particular fairy tale of the original work. And it's actually female. It's actually a female who wrote this story, which is rather interesting because before we've been seeing Andersen and the Brothers Grimm and such. So it's nice to see a female writer now sort of taking the reins for this particular work. So basically the differences that exist between these two works in particular has to do with what it really revolves around. And the characters involved. For example, in the original work, it literally opens up explaining sort of Belle's family. And Belle's family is structured with 3 brothers and 3 sisters, including herself, so 2 other sisters. And her father is not a inventor like in the Disney version. He's a merchant, basically. A merchant who makes a decent sized amount of money, and in doing so, his 2 daughters that aren't Belle sort of get spoiled by that, and you kind of see how their characters are sort of similar in the way to kind of Cinderella's sister, and how they are envious of Belle's sort of kindness. And for the most part, her character is fairly structured in the same way, but there is a key difference that I want to mention, but I will get to that once the plot is sort of revealed to you and explained, when I'm comparing and contrasting the 2 different plots, I should say. But for the most part, what you need to kind of understand is that there is this difference in family, and with the Disney version, she has no siblings at all. And not even a mother, and there's no mother in the original work as well. And also an important thing to note is that Gaston, from what I've read from the original work, does not really necessarily appear at all, or really provide an impact as to the story. Not so much. It's more... it more leans onto the idea of the sisters sort of being the kind of antagonists, as you could say, because of their jealousy. But for the most part, that's pretty much how a lot of the characters are structured. And it's also mentioned too, how Belle likes to read, and she takes care of the house when her sisters don't, and she contributes a lot to the family, whereas the other sisters are fairly selfish and self-centered. So that kind of rings in as well, as being part of the story. Now, basically what ends up happening, sort of, as this plot is sort of being revealed to you in the original work, is that the merchant, being Belle's dad in this case, in the original work, he basically loses his entire fortune, so they have to kind of live under different circumstances and live in more poor-like conditions. So he ends up accepting a small country house at a great distance from the town that they were originally housed in. And basically they just live a more small kind of a lifestyle. And I think this is similar to the Disney work too, and how Belle is fairly new to the small town that she ends up moving to. So again, there is this kind of there's this hint at this transition of her moving into a different place. But it doesn't really focus on the members of the town all that much in the original work at all. Really, it focuses in on the family for the most part. And it seems like that the sisters sort of treat Belle as this fairly oddball, and kind of look at her in the same way as the townspeople look at her in the Disney work. So really, it's just taking different characters and just putting them in a different circumstance. I thought that was interesting how Disney decided to do that and make it sort of the town people being judgmental on her, as opposed to the sisters, which are in the original work. So basically you have this sort of happen, and you see how sort of with the characters, how Belle is the one who's sort of the virtuous one who takes care of the house, and the sisters don't really actively involved. The brothers are rarely mentioned in this at all. I don't even think they're given names, and I don't think even the sisters are given names necessarily. But it seems like Belle is the only one who seems to be the most virtuous of the bunch. And basically what ends up happening is they end up living a year in this small little country house. I believe they call it a country house. Yeah. The whole family lives there for a while, and then the merchant, being Belle's dad in this case, receives a letter with an account that a vessel on board of which he had effects was safely arrived. So him being a merchant, this kind of makes sense that, he sells stuff. So I guess when you figure out that your shipments came in and that's okay and you can sell them now, then your circumstances are probably going to be a lot better. So basically what ends up happening is that this news, according to the source material that I have right here, the news had liked to have turned the heads of the two elder daughters, who immediately flattered themselves with the hopes of returning to town, for they were quite weary of a country life. And when they saw their father ready to set out, they begged him to buy them new gowns, headdresses, ribbons, and all manners of trifles. But Beauty asked for nothing, for she thought to herself that all the money her father was going to receive would scarce be sufficient to purchase everything her sisters wanted. So really, again, the original work is trying to emphasize this whole point of how Belle is the one who's the more virtuous one and the least self-centered of the daughters. And basically we get this whole transition into how the merchant father goes back to the town to basically get the stuff from what it was from the vessel. And you kind of get this interesting point, though, in which even though Belle doesn't initially ask for anything, she feels like that she should ask for something, since her sisters asked for something, and so basically all she asks for her dad is to have give her basically a rose when he returns, and which I think is rather interesting how that's incorporated into the original work. Unlike the Disney version, where a rose appears in the beginning and is sort of magical, and offers a magical symbolism to the whole story and the passage of time. But in the original work, it does seem like that the rose is just something that she likes, and that she could only think of as something that she would like to receive from her dad once he comes back. So literally as that's happening, you see how the merchant ends up getting lost on his way back home, and basically he ends up finding the Beast's castle, similar to the Disney work, except in the Disney work you'll see how Maurice, again, Belle's dad, he's actually given a name, unlike in the original work, but Maurice ends up in the castle being lost. He's actually chased down by some wolves, even though here it does mention the possibility of wolves being in the forest. It doesn't really say that they come and attack him, but in the Disney version they actually do come and attack him, and so that's how he ends up basically at the castle. But here it seems like he just stumbles upon it, and he just ends up being lost. So really that's kind of how ultimately it plays into where we finally are introduced to the Beast ultimately. But the original work as well as the Disney work kind of go in these different directions. In the original work, he actually stays overnight, because he goes to the palace and nobody is there. Nobody shows up at all, and literally he sees the next day food, I believe it's on I believe it's just on the table or something to that effect. And he also sees the next morning a good suit of clothes. So it's almost like the Beast sort of plays this kind of mystery game with him. It doesn't really reveal himself, which can kind of make sense if he's ashamed of the way he looks. And at first he thinks it's like a fairy, which is I thought was rather amusing how he thinks it's a fairy. And basically, before he decides, see, the thing is too is just that since he really wants to get home, he just decides when he wakes up the next day from being in the palace, oh, okay, I should just go home now. So he tries to go home, but there is this I believe it's a garden or something. Let me see here. Well, I guess they call it an arbor. I don't really know what an arbor necessarily means, but they call it an arbor of roses. So he basically stumbles upon these arbors of roses, and he goes, "Oh, I should give one to Belle, my daughter, Beauty," or, well, she's called Beauty, but Belle literally translated means beauty. But at the same time, he decides, I'm going to, in the original work, give her a rose. So he takes one, and then that's when the Beast shows up. And the Beast is mad. He's mad that he wants to take one of his roses, because he believes them to be fairly precious to him. And so he kind of says, for a punishment, I'm basically going to kill you. And the merchant asks, please, can I stay? Or please, can I do something? Please don't kill me, just sort of begging. And then basically the Beast says, I will forgive you on condition that one of them, meaning one of the daughters, comes willingly and suffer for you. Let me have no words, but go about your business and swear that if your daughter refused to die in your stead, you will return within 3 months. So basically he just kind of threatens him. And the interesting thing too is that ultimately, as the merchant is trying to explain himself, he says, "Oh, I was just picking this flower for one of my daughters," and the Beast kind of goes, "Oh, you have daughters now, ha ha ha." So he goes, "Well, I'll make you a deal here, just give me one of your daughters in exchange for you." And basically the merchant ends up sort of agreeing to this, even though deep down he really does not want to, do that. But he ends up leaving, but still keeping his word that he would do what he's asked, even though ultimately he wanted to be the one to come back and, sort of really sacrifice himself. But as he comes back and he tells his whole family this kind of story, Belle decides to take the initiative and says, I will take your place, Dad. That's totally fine. Now, what you have to understand is that from what I've explained up to this point, the Disney work handles itself way differently. In the introduction, we're given sort of a look into the town, as well as with Belle's character. We get to see the character Gaston, who we immediately know is our antagonist. We get a sense of what Belle wants, ultimately. We also get this whole idea of Maurice being an inventor, and so he's intended to go to this fair, and that's where he ends up getting lost and attacked by wolves and captured by the Beast, essentially. And is literally caught the day of. There's no sleepover, he's just put into a dungeon. Unlike this Beast, who kind of says, "Yeah, I'm gonna kill you unless you hand over one of your daughters to me," which could be fairly extreme for some people, probably. But for the most part, the Disney work plays itself out that way, and then Belle discovers through her horse, Philippe, that Maurice is missing, and she goes off to find him, and then she ends up running into the castle and seeing him, and that's where the whole exchange takes place, and she sees the Beast for the first time, and she says that she'll sacrifice herself in return for her father's freedom. But it's basically an exchange of freedom so much. It seems like in the original work, even though the Beast says that he wants to, he says that in the end you'll die. He ultimately doesn't kill Belle at all. No, in the original work. In the original work, he just sort of keeps her as kind of like his prisoner, like in the Disney work. But again, it seems like both Belles seem to be willing to sacrifice themselves, despite both of the fathers in both the original and the Disney work sort of having this strong resistance to their decision, even though ultimately that's what ends up being decided for the most part. And the interesting thing is that in the original work, once Belle hears about this, the merchant along with Beauty decide to go back together, and they go back together in the castle, and then ultimately Beast kind of says, okay, bye-bye now, Daddy, you're gone, shoo-shoo, she's mine now. And so that's really what ends up happening ultimately, and Beauty cries, obviously, but is willing to sacrifice herself for her dad. And at first, initially, she feels like that the Beast will want to eat her, that he'll want to devour her, basically. Whereas in the Disney work, that's not really a fear. It's just more of the fear of what he looks like. And it's also too on how there is this emphasis a lot in the Disney version at how cruel he is. You know, he's really mean in the beginning. You know, and then they have the whole dinner debacle that you see in the Disney work, where he wants to ultimately make her love him somehow, because again, that's pretty much how the whole curse in Disney works. But I'll explain that later on, because it's not until the end of the original work that the curse is really explained. But as far as the Disney version goes, the Beast is treated as a fairly ruthless brute in the beginning, with no sympathy or really remorse or any of that kind of stuff. He's just very authoritative and angry. And in this version, he's kind of played differently, and I'll kind of explain that as I go through here. And basically, we get this whole bit of Belle being kind of adjusted into living in the palace, but she still thinks that she's gonna die. She still thinks that the Beast is gonna want to eat her. But it kind of does play with this idea of her having her own place within the palace. And there's at one point where she ends up finding a library, and then it's interesting too, as she's looking through the library, she ends up finding a book, and the book reads, well, in gold letters, "Welcome, Beauty, banish fear. You are queen and mistress here. Speak your wishes and speak your will. Swift obedience meets them still." And that I thought was interesting too. The original, or in the Disney version, there is no gold letters and and her opening a book and reading those letters, no. But there's also an interesting thing too, in that the Disney version plays itself out with the Beast being, or since the Beast is being played out as authoritative in the Disney work, he literally banishes Belle from going really to certain locations, in particular the West Wing, which there's no mention of a West Wing in the original work at all. But there is this kind of authoritative presence that he has on her in the beginning, sort of. And it's also interesting too, because in the original work, this is where we get the mirror. In the Disney work, we see the mirror sort of appear in the beginning, and then we see the Beast actually using the mirror. But in the original work, it seems to be that only Belle uses it, and basically after she reads these golden words within this book, she says, "Alas, there is nothing I desire so much as to see my poor father and know what he is doing." She had no sooner said this when, casting her eyes on a great looking-glass, to her great amazement she saw her own home, where her father arrived with a very dejected countenance. So that's really what this kind of looking-glass sort of does, and in the Disney work it's pretty much played out in the same way. You can just look within the glass and then it'll show you whatever you want to see. So for the most part, it seems like that's really how the original work plays into this, into these kinds of bits of magic and sort of mystery. And in the Disney work, it seems a lot, the magic seems a lot more distinct and out there, especially with the talking clock, Cogsworth, Lumiere, Mrs. Potts, all those Tinker toys are not at all in the original work. There's no stuff that comes to life, really. There's no really reference of anything coming to life. It's all pretty much just an ordinary palace, but within this ordinary palace there's this beast that's really all that the original work seems to entail. And basically what ends up happening is that there really isn't a lot of confrontation between Belle and the Beast so much in the original work. In the Disney work, it plays out to this idea of that they fight, that they have conflicts, especially with the way beginning when when Belle doesn't want to go to dinner, and also after she tries to escape and the Beast saves her from the wolves. None of that in the original work. None of that at all. That's totally scrapped. But it does seem like that there is this whole kind of rivalry between the two, and then you sort of see how later on their defenses are being put down, and they kind of start out fresh and new, and then they realize that they're somehow meant for each other. But it seems like in the original work, it plays out to this idea of the Beast being fairly nice to Belle for the most part. And she actually is pretty much treated as sort of a guest throughout the entire original work. Even though there was this initial fear threat that she was going to be eaten, but really it seems like that they seem to have sort of more of a less confrontational conversation for the most part in the original work. And it's kind of funny how this conversation plays out. "Beauty," said the monster, "will you give me leave to see you sup? And that's basically he's asking, can I sit down with you to have supper with you? Because he basically just makes out dinner for her. And then she says, that is as you please. No, replied Beast, you alone are mistress here. You need only bid me gone, if my presence is troublesome, and I will immediately withdraw. But tell me, do you not think me very ugly? That is true, said Beauty, for I cannot tell a lie, but I believe you are very good-natured. So I am, said the monster, but then, besides my ugliness, I have no sense. I know very well that I am a poor, silly, stupid creature. 'Tis no sign of folly to think so, replied Beauty, for never did fool know this, or had so humble a conceit of his own understanding. Eat then, Beauty, said the monster, and endeavour to amuse yourself in your palace, for everything here is yours, and I should be very uneasy if you were not happy. So really, it seems like in the original work, this conversation of openness and sincerity and giving is really displayed in the way beginning, for the most part, between Belle and Beast's relationship, whereas in the Disney work it takes its time to sort of have Beast sort of change his ways in order for them to sort of get to this point of them being civil and nice to each other and starting to like each other. Whereas in the original work it's fairly clear that Beast is sort of, I think, fairly misunderstood, rather than the Disney work, who plays him out as somebody that needs to be changed and altered through time. And it does seem like that the original work was going for this idea of Beast sort of being the humble servant and trying to treat her as a guest in the beginning. In the original work, he sort of treats her like a prisoner, or in the Disney work, he treats her sort of more like a prisoner in the beginning, but then once he starts changing his ways, she becomes more like a guest and treated more with more respect and dignity. Whereas in the original work, it's clearly stated that he's sort of her servant, and that he would basically do anything for her in order to please her. So that's that. And for the most part, it's basically Beast's character is fairly grounded in the original work, meaning he doesn't get angry, he never raises his voice, he never gets frustrated for the most part. The only time he really gets frustrated is in the beginning when when the merchant just tries to steal his roses. Really, that's really the only time you see him being overly confrontational. And unlike in the Disney work, where it's not really explained how long Belle and Beast get to really know each other, it's established in the original work that she stays there for 3 months. And the interesting thing, though, is that as these months go on, Beast sort of brings up this question of marriage, and he basically asks Beauty if she wouldn't mind taking his hand, and she kind of refuses. Now, this is, I think, a distinct characteristic that's different between the Disney work and the original work when it comes to Belle's character. In the original work, it almost seems like Belle is learning the lesson here, and learning to appreciate someone despite their appearance. Whereas in the original work, it's really about the Beast learning to change his ways and see the beauty within himself. So that's really a clear, distinct difference. And it's not that Belle is is mean or cold-hearted or really like an antagonist, like Gaston is in the Disney work. She is kind and she is respectful to him, but at the same time there is this kind of factor in here, like, I don't know if I want to marry you. I don't think this could really work out. Yeah, I don't really know, because you're a beast. It's that kind of a flaw within her character to not see past his appearance. Now, she does appreciate the things that he has within himself. That's clear. But I guess it's just hard for her to take in the fact that he is a beast and that he wants to marry her. So, and that again has to do with sort of the looks factor. And basically, after these months go by, she kind of starts to worry about her family, and she really misses her dad. And Beast says, okay, you can go visit your family for a week, but no more than a week, otherwise I'm gonna die because of grief, because you're leaving. Because he's clearly in love with her and has been for these past months. And she decides to return to her family for a week, and then she makes the promise that she would return to him. But also I want to make it clear, though, too, that when she does refuse to marry the Beast initially in the original work, she almost says it to the point of, like, I can't see you in that way. And it almost has to do really because of the appearance. I can't see you as a lover because of your appearance. But it's not really in such a mean-spirited way. I think it's just it's just something that's just part of how she perceives him, as more of a friend, really. And I think that's mostly to do because of that appearance factor, for the most part. So she does ultimately return to her family, and these other daughters, when they see her return, they're kind of pissed off because they're like, oh, she's back, joy. And they kind of are just fairly jealous of her. And so they decide to act rather kind towards her so that she'll end up staying more than 1 week. And their whole idea was that, oh, if she stays more than 1 week, the Beast is gonna be pissed. He's gonna eat her, because he's gonna be even more pissed, so he'll eat her. Which really is not the case at all. But they just assume that and decide to be fairly nice to her. And so she does end up staying more than the time that was allowed or allotted to her. And what ends up happening is that within that time frame, it also should be noted that these sisters ended up marrying these fairly well-to-do men, and they're both but these men are also fairly self-righteous and are very fairly self-centered, and don't really don't really offer, you know, kindness or virtues that the Beast offers. And Belle kind of starts to realize this, that ultimately it's not the looks that matter, it's what's inside that counts. And I'm going to read a portion of it that sort of, I think, summarizes really what the original work and the Disney work are trying to say. And this is when Belle is sort of talking about the Beast. He is kind and good, and that is sufficient. Why did I refuse to marry him? I should be happier with the monster than my sisters are with their husbands. It is neither wit nor a fine person in a husband that makes a woman happy, but virtue, sweetness of temper, and complacence. And Beast has all these valuable qualifications. So really, she ends up realizing her sort of mistake and going, well, why did I refuse? You know, this is just because of what he looks like. That's not a good reason for me to do that. And ultimately, she decides to go back, even though she kind of knows that she's past her time, and the Beast was telling her, I'm probably going to die of grief if you don't come back within a week. And basically what ends up happening is that she discovers him, I believe, in the garden, and basically he sort of says, oh, you forgot your promise now, and I was starving myself, but at least I'll die happy. That's basically what he says. And ultimately she confesses her love for him, sort of similar to the Disney work, but I'll get into the whole curse thing towards the end, the differences between the two. But basically she says that she loves him, and ultimately that's what makes it so that he can become a prince again, because he was a prince originally, the same way in the Disney version. And once he turns back, he sort of explains to her, you might be confused here. Here, let me explain this to you. You see him at your feet, said the prince. A wicked fairy has condemned me to remain under that shape, until a beautiful virgin should consent to marry me. The fairy likewise enjoined me to conceal my understanding. There was only you in the world, generous enough to be won by the goodness of my temper, and in offering you my crown, I can't discharge the obligations I have to you. So really it doesn't explain ultimately why he's cursed, or why he was cursed, but ultimately the only way to break the spell was a consent for marriage. But in the Disney work, it's played out fairly differently and is explained in the beginning. Beast pretty much is condemned in the Disney work because of the fact that he was spoiled, selfish, and unkind. So that's why the fairy was like, yep, you should suffer for that. You should suffer for being a jerk. And her whole thing is before the last petal falls on the magic rose, again, hence in the Disney work, before that last petal falls, you need to find someone who will love you, that you will love, and that will love you in return. That's really the only thing that Disney says. I mean, Disney doesn't really mention the whole concept of marriage or consenting to marriage. So I thought that was kind of interesting how the original work decided, yeah, we're gonna go with marriage here, but in the Disney work they just said, no, it's just love. We'll just have it be love. That's it. But I find it interesting how Disney gave a fairly logical reason as to why the beast was cursed. But it seems like here, this wicked fairy doesn't really have a reason to curse him. She's just like, yep, I'm going to put this on you. So for the most part, it ends with basically her and the beast living together happily in the original work, similar to the Disney work, with, you know, the nice the nice stained glass wall they have at the end. But there's also something else that I think should be noted in the original work, and I'll quote it from here. Beauty, said this lady, and this lady is, I believe to be, I believe I don't know if the fair or beautiful lady is the same as the fairy, but basically she says, Beauty, come and receive the reward of your judicious choice. You have preferred virtue before either wit or beauty, and deserve to find a person in whom all these qualifications are united. You are going to be a great queen. I hope the throne will not lessen your virtue or make you forget yourself. As to you, ladies, said the fairy to Beauty's two sisters, I know your hearts and the malice they contain. Become two statues, but until this transformation, still retain your reason. You shall stand before your sister's palace gate, and be it your punishment to behold her happiness, and it will not be in your power to return to your former state until you own your faults. But I am very much afraid that you always remain statues. Pride, anger, gluttony, and idealness are sometimes conquered, but the conversion of a malicious and envious mind is a kind of miracle. So basically, this fairy ultimately says, yeah, you guys are gonna get your just desserts. Whereas in the Disney work, we have the antagonist being Gaston, and he ends up falling off the very high tower of the castle when he fights Beast in the climax, and gets all the townspeople to basically try to join him and fight. But really, that's kind of how the original work ends, with the sisters getting their just desserts. And again, the merchant and the entire family, they basically end up, I think, following Belle, sort of, to the castle, and that's how the fairy, I guess, ends up being there with them at the castle, and then saying all this stuff, and then ultimately putting this curse on the sisters. But yeah, that's really how the original work ends. Not the most logical tale, but either way, I think and I think that's really ultimately how you can perceive this for the most part. It seems like the original work took the idea of really ultimately Belle learning the lesson, whereas the Disney work takes it to the effect of Beast being the one who ends up learning the lesson of not judging a book by its cover ultimately. But what you kind of have to understand is that Disney again put in a lot of other things within the story. It seems like, from what I can read from this work, it's fairly condensed compared to the Disney work. In the Disney work, there's a lot more that I think happens, especially with Gaston, especially with Belle and the Beast, especially with the other characters as well. It seems like there's just a lot more there, whereas the original work just focuses in on this theme with these characters and just sort of condenses it down to a fairly shorter tale. because as you can see, it's fairly straightforward in how it goes about itself. Whereas the Disney work, there's a lot of I think there's just a lot of energy and a lot of suspense and a lot of different things and emotions going through the entire story that it makes it very very entertaining and engaging. Whereas the original work is just trying to make it about this make it more simplistic, I think, for the most part, and just saying, yeah, just don't judge a book, by ultimately the cover. In the end of the day, it's all about what the person has to offer within themselves that really ultimately makes them worthy or unworthy of someone's love or affection, ultimately. That's really the entire gist of this whole entire work, for the most part. Comparing the two between Disney, I think really I can't compare and contrast anything else, because ultimately, for the most part, what I've explained already is pretty much sums up everything. But if anyone has any questions, comments, concerns, I'd be more than happy to answer them. But I think that's really all I can say. And yeah, as I don't know if I've mentioned this yet or before, but had to skip Rescuers Down Under because it wasn't based upon anything. But the next one should be fairly interesting as well, because we'll be diving into another Disney princess movie. And you might be wondering what that one is, but I think you can probably guess if you just look at the lineup and and where we are in Disney history. So, just finished up 1991, a year before I was born, and moving on to, I believe it was 1994. But until next time, bye-bye.